everyone's focused on fentanyl, but MDMA, methamphetamine, ketamine, fentanyl, any number of other chemical drugs originating from Chinese factories in chemical precursor form are sent into British Columbia because we have no border controls, effectively no police, effectively no courts, which is what this story gets to. And they're produced in Canada and shipped around the world, including the United States.
Sam Cooper, back on North American soil, returns from the depths of Adriatic Europe. My brother, it is so good to see you again. I have been reading your stories while you were gone, staring through rainy window panes and wishing you were home. How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. I was working on my second career as an Adriatic lawn swimmer and, building up my stamina, feeling good. It's good to be back, but I gotta say, since starting my platform here, which is now without a doubt getting traction at the highest levels of the US government, I know this, it's helping with policy in the world, but getting it up and running has been a full out sprint for over 2 years now.
Yeah.
Memorably, within a couple of weeks starting, I'm just reminiscing now. We'll get to the modern times, but within a few weeks of starting, I was asked to testify in Parliament, as I've told you. And 2 days later, an RCMP National Security Unit knocked on my door. And I don't need to say too much about that, except that the RCMP they know who's involved, I believe. They know how it connects to the election interference story. They know how it connects to drugs. They know how it connects to everything they can't touch in Canada. And so in my learned estimation, now it's going to be up to the US government to do Canada's work, and that's where we are. But I've survived whatever, the bad people, and there are a lot of them in Canada, including a lot in Ottawa, have had to throw at me. I'm up and running now. I'm always going to report on Canada, but I don't need Canada. I'm reporting for the world. I'll never give up on reporting what needs to be reported in Canada, even if I'm doing it in the sense of a drone striking something that needs to be taken out. I'll keep doing it. But what I wanted to say is this is probably the first week-long break I've been able to totally detach from work, come back and with a lot of perspective. And so here we are. That's my summer musings for you.
Oh, dude. I was finally able to peel my bureau hat off of my wife's head. And it's just good to see you again, brother. I said this before we started, but I'm taking a similar track as you. I'm not giving up on Canada completely, but I'm shifting my focus to the wider world outside. And as I do that, the more I come to realize the intricate role that Canada plays in a lot of this. Like I spoke to Steve Robinson last week about the exact same thing we're experiencing in Canada now happening in Maine and stretching, westward in the United States. And the more I'm talking to people from different parts of the world, the more I'm realizing the real role that we have in all this. And I think that's with Canadians, we have this, we're very isolated as a population. So we don't really have much of a view of the outside world. And it isn't until you're talking to people from all other parts of the world that you realize that a lot of this actually centers around Canada, our involvement with China, and the amount of organized crime that is operating here. Right. And it's, Sam, I said this before we started recording, but I want to say this publicly. Like, as I'm talking to more and more journalists and more people, every time your name comes up, brother, you are held in the highest esteem. And I just want to say, man, I am having done this now for a year and a half and, 20 plus conversations, a lot of Brave New Normal's growth has been due to the conversations that you and I have had. And, I think the impact that you're having on the world is far greater than you or I or really anybody watching this knows. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying we're making it happen. We're doing something. You know what I mean?
Thanks for saying that. It's been a lot of deep conversations, and yeah, I mean it. I'll be watching the Sean Ryan podcast or various big American podcasts, and I'm not, I'm glad that my reporting and thinking is now making its way into what other experts that I really appreciate are putting forward. And some of that stems from the book Willful Blindness that has become, a touchstone for a lot of experts, worldwide now. It's strange to say that in a way because we're taught as Canadians that, I mean, some of us have always believed we can be the best in the world, and we show it in certain areas, but I don't think we celebrate. This is an old story, but we don't celebrate our leadership enough. And in my view, very unfortunately, the worst of us that have sold out to get where they are too often in power in Canada. And to what you're saying, yeah, I do think that some very smart people around the world are realizing, you couldn't make it up in Hollywood that someone like Premier David Eby and BC Ferries are giving a $1 billion ferry deal funded under the table by an Ottawa bank, basically, a development bank. It's an old story that we've covered in many ways, but just to get to the point, people like David Eby now are a very strong national security risk to North America. There's no way to sugarcoat this from the way that he's giving away. And I know you come from a First Nations background, and I'm very, very, very tuned into, what Canada needs to do to redress the past wrongs. But not to get off on a tangent, just giving away lands like at the snap of a finger to First Nations that I know for a fact are under the influence of CCP, actors, is just another way that David Eby is a national security risk to Canada. And I've written about how the port of Vancouver is so deeply captured. And, when Kash Patel or President Trump or other people say some mean things about Vancouver, they're entirely accurate. And as you know, I do story after story that proves the point of that. So, yeah, a roundabout way to say that, yes, I do take it modestly that I'm pushing forward some ideas about how Canada is being used in the same way that Mexico, Belize, or Venezuela is being used by bad actors. Canada has been too used by bad actors, and now a lot, hopefully more people in Canada are starting to realize that, along with some smart people around the world.
Well, I'll just say this, I'm reaching out to some pretty high profile journalists and, people who have been in the public eye for a long time. And what I always use as part of the pitch when I'm talking to journalists is, here's an interview. Here's one of my episodes with Sam Cooper, so you get a feel for who I am. And the immediate response is, oh, yeah, you're talking to Sam Cooper. I'm in. Let's go. Right. So that just shows like the way you're resonating, not just in your profession, but with people who are highly respected and represent the utmost of journalistic integrity. Right.
I appreciate that. And if you walked around into the CBC newsroom in downtown Ottawa, you wouldn't hear the same story.
But your picture's on a dartboard, brother.
It's really a reflection of how captured, their main figureheads in that, in CBC and Ottawa are. And I don't want to get off on that tangent, but CBC does some great work, and they've got some horrible journalists that are just press, liberal government press spokespeople at the end of the day. And that's another thing that, I'm not afraid to hammer away on that anymore, because what they're doing is just leading Canadians astray when they say that Canada isn't becoming an increasing fentanyl problem for the world or these kind of things.
Absolutely. And the truth is nobody knows any of their names or who they are. They're just words on a website that nobody reads. And that's the truth. And the reason why that is the truth is because I think people are searching for the truth. And in that search for the truth, anything government funded or related to CBC, CTV, Globe and Mail, any of the major newspapers, which Sam, I will first and foremost say that you know that there is some good journalism happening at places
Yeah.
like Globe and Mail, but for the most part, people are bypassing those news outlets now and going to places like the Bureau because they know that even if they disagree with Sam Cooper, at least Sam Cooper's given it to them straight. And that's why people are paying attention to you, you know, like going and just going into the First Nations thing. I just want to comment on that because I am Métis. My mother is Plains Cree Indian, but there's right and wrong. And I think that's what we have to start standing for. It doesn't matter what color, skin color somebody has or what blood is in their veins or what their ancestry is. There's right and wrong. And we have to start calling out right and wrong and see through racial boundaries and barriers because that's what got us into this mess in the first place, right? And we're in this place, like, you know, talking to Steve Robinson last week, you know, he brought up the point that in Maine, you know, there's illegal Chinese cannabis operations happening all across the state. And they can't do anything about it because the state and local police and, well, the state government appears to be in on it. But the people who aren't are afraid to approach it because of the optics, because they're afraid of getting hit with that racism tag. And so they just have hundreds of Chinese illegal grow operations happening where they're using dangerous neurotoxins as pesticides and fungicides for these plants that are showing up all the way in California.
Yeah.
Right across the country. And this all stems from people just being afraid to tackle it because they're Chinese, they're not white.
It's a familiar story that, you know, there are historic Rons and there are modern Rons, and then there are intelligence services from other countries that know how to exploit, you know, those real social issues as shields, and that's exactly what China does in North America. And again, I'm glad that, you know, more people on balance are starting to realize. Not that it's not what you're saying, that you just have to throw away the skin color and get to what's right and wrong for our nation. Otherwise, our nation won't continue to exist. But beyond that, I think people are understanding, and you need to do it in a respectful way. But if a foreign intelligence service is like, I'll give you an example, not to get off topic, how Chinese intelligence services get close to First Nations and leverage the stories of graveyards and, you know, whether or not there are children buried somewhere, or leverage, you know, the very real past wrongs of that the Canadian government was involved in and the present imbalances. The Chinese will get next to those First Nations specifically to use their resources to corrupt their leaders in the way they try to pretty successfully corrupt mainstream society. And they'll say, you know, to Canada, you can't criticize us for our genocide, modern genocide in Xinjiang, because you're accused in some academic reports of, you know, a type of genocide, right? So, yeah, I've been saying that kind of thing for a while, and it, again, you know, it's hard to believe at first, but the more and more that you realize China's doing that with indigenous populations around the world, and I know this, you know, you can start to tell people in Canada, okay, let's get to the bottom of, you know, some of these narratives.
Yeah, and when you do, your inbox fills up with people referring to Sam Cooper as the dishonorable ex-journalist, fired journalist, Sam Cooper. It's so crazy because it's like, this is the thing. And I'm saying that because it's like, every time you and I record an episode together and I put it out there, it's like my inbox, dishonorable Sam Cooper. And it's using language that we don't traditionally use in our Western culture, right? So you know where it's coming from, and it's like, come on, guys.
There
like,
are
really?
literal websites that are Chinese run that are running that kind of story, and you know that line that you said that Chinese intelligence and their criminal puppets in Canada use has even been tested in court, and it's been proven false. So I don't know. I don't even care about those people. I don't have, you know, the time or mental space to deal with like criminals and idiots because I just have better things to do. But yeah, if anyone comes out and says that in a way that really matters, I don't even need to bother, but I could take care of them.
Yeah, we can move on. So on that note, I want to start today's discussion highlighting a piece you recently ran. You ran a piece about a scientist. I believe she was working out of University of British Columbia, who was caught picking up, I think it was, how many kilograms of methamphetamine precursor was it?
Yeah, so I'll give you the big hits on that story, and some of it I've reported very carefully, for several reasons. But so in terms of everything I know and everything I could report in the future, I'm not going to say everything today. But yeah, it's an explosive story. Chinese trained scientist comes to Canada to work under the Thousand Talents Plan, which we've talked about. This is the same program that is coming up in the recent FBI cases, where you've got Chinese students coming into U.S. universities, especially in Michigan, and whether it's an agro-terror potential weapon case, or sending U.S. intellectual property from universities back to China. This is part of Xi Jinping's weaponized plan to use Chinese university students who give pledges to the Chinese Communist Party in order to get dual funding and come into Canada or the United States or elsewhere in the West and be a spy, to use our taxpayer funded university capacity, steal our leading scientific findings. And as we've talked about in the Winnipeg lab case, use our capacity for bioweapons is what's come out of Canadian government documents. So in this case, senior Chinese scientist, extremely connected to Unite. I didn't report this in the story. Perhaps I'll report in more detail. I haven't named the 57-year-old woman because her case was dropped. I'm just backing and forwarding here, but in BC court records, she is accused of precursor or controlled substance import-export. Charged in June 2022. The case is dropped for no reason, or as they stayed the proceedings. This is a federal prosecutor's unexplained decision to not move forward with this very serious case. And that's the point of my story. So more details here. I found out from sources with awareness of the court file. This Chinese scientist was caught red-handed picking up precursors for MDMA. And as Vancouver, huge MDMA producer. Everyone, we've known this for decades now. Everyone's focused on fentanyl, but MDMA, methamphetamine, ketamine, fentanyl, any number of other chemical drugs originating from Chinese factories in chemical precursor form are sent into British Columbia because we have no border controls, effectively no police, effectively no courts, which is what this story gets to. And they're produced in Canada and shipped around the world, including the United States. And so in this case, my source information is she's caught red-handed picking up, MDMA precursors. And I could say a lot more about what I know in the classified realm, but what I reported in the story is after 10 court appearances, the case is just dropped. I don't know why, but in the context of the U.S. government saying, Canada, you have a major problem in BC. Mayor Brad West from Port Coquitlam repeatedly disclosing to me that a previous Secretary of State, not President Trump's, shared with Brad West that the U.S. government has a deep concern with Canada's lack of capacity of being able to prosecute major Chinese drug trafficking, money laundering cases in BC. And the U.S. government has a major concern that Vancouver is a production hub, a money laundering hub for international crime involved in fentanyl. And so in this case, it's just a case in point that a Chinese actor is not charged. Rather, she's not taken to trial. And so more details on that. I know you've got lots of questions, but I dug deeper into her networks. There's a lot that I know, but what I reported was she's very connected to Health Canada licensed cannabis companies. which, as I've been reporting, have basically been taken over by Chinese organized crime. And that's just one of the factors that, adds to the profile of this scientist that I haven't named, but called Dr. X for my story. And, other big things. She graduated from a university in China, which is listed in, Western intelligence as a high risk institution involved in China's military civilian dual use sort of espionage, and even getting funding from the Ministry of State Security. So those are sort of the high level bullets of another case. Dies on the vine in Canada, a scientist with deep connections to China's government. This is on the face of it and provable in documents. And I know a lot more about this person that I haven't reported yet, as to their connections to China's United Front system in Canada. So it's just a concrete case that's putting the cherry on top of what I've been talking to you about for over a year, of how the Chinese government and Chinese intelligence services appear to be not just allowing drug trafficking to happen through Canada, but directing it, wanting it to happen. And this is what the American government says, no matter how much uninformed people in Canada raise their eyebrows or roll their eyes at that. This is what the American government says and believes. And this is another case, I'm saying, that just another nail in that coffin of proving that case.
Okay, so we don't know why the charges against her were dropped. There's no indication in any of the documents that there was any reason to lack of evidence or anything like that. I mean, there's no lack of evidence because she's caught in Richmond with the precursor, right? So
this is according to sources that she's caught red-handed with the precursor. And I could say a lot more from the classified realm, but for sensitivity and source reasons, I won't say everything that I know. But the concern here is that the Canadian government, whether it's that a stay of proceedings could result because the Crown, meaning the government prosecutor, in their own discretion, decides it's not in the public interest to continue. What does that mean? That could not to be trite here, but that could mean that Mark Carney doesn't want the case to continue. It could mean anything. It could mean that this scientist has deep connections to the University of BC and other Canadian universities and other well-connected people in Canada, and that it's not going to look very good if you're a conspirational thinker. And I'm not going there. I mean, there could be a lot of reasons why the Crown, in its own discretion, decides it's not good to proceed here. It could be, a witness's identity is leaked, or maybe this scientist lawyer has, persuasively argued that their client is but a cog in a larger, much more dangerous operation, and in fact was not even acting of their will and may die if the case is going forward. Obviously I'm speculating here, but I can tell you with 100% confidence that the way I found out about this case is because of the concern that there's no good reason based on the evidence that's known, there's no good reason for this case to die on the vine. And in the context of what the US government is saying about Canada, and not just the Trump administration, as I'm saying, it looks horrific that a case like this can't proceed. And what are the results? If someone that has institutional level connections to the precursor suppliers that are state, sanctioned in China, that are funneling those precursors into Canada and using Canada essentially, as a tool, or if you want to call it as part of a chemical warfare operation, as some people believe fentanyl is, then that's a problem that Canada can't prosecute a case. And it's just, there could be better reasons or worse reasons, but at the end of the day, it's a case that every indication is strongly provable and doesn't proceed to trial.
So, as the conspiracy guy that sits next to you on screen every other week, I look at this and this is just another grain of sand in a growing mountain. I mean, if this was a one off circumstance, I would give it the benefit of the doubt and say, okay,
Yeah.
maybe there was something, about the case that didn't make sense or didn't connect, or maybe there was, circumstantial evidence that didn't pan out. But brother, you
It's
and I, you've been on this for years, man. It's just another.
it's extremely fair what you say, because this case, what I know and reported in the story is the networks that this scientist are directly tied to, including a lawyer, including corporate entities, locations, directly stem out of that e-pirate network case that I've talked about, Canada's largest ever money laundering case. Another one with the leaders of what's called the Sam Gore cartel in Vancouver. Of course, it went broadly across Canada and North America. Of course, the US government was concerned about it. Of course, Vancouver was being used and used easily. Over $1 billion laundered through BC government regulated casinos, not to mention the real estate connected. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken said directly to Mayor Brad West in that fentanyl, MDMA, cocaine, everything laundered through Vancouver case, we, the US government, have a concern that your courts can't do anything about these cases, and your city, your country is being used because it has the corporate structures for money laundering and drug trafficking. Again, not Kash Patel, not President Donald Trump. This is Joe Biden's Secretary of State talking to a trusted Canadian politician among many non-trusted Canadian politicians, and telling that politician of integrity, Brad West, we think Vancouver's got a big problem, right? And so you're right. For you, if you want to say you're someone that asks some questions, some of them may turn into a real conspiracy. Some of them may die on the vine of conspiracy theories.
Right.
But look, this case, my information grows straight out of that network that US government already has a concern about, right? So yeah, it's another grain in a growing mountain of if you want to call it systemic corruption in Premier David Eby's province, or the worst type of corruption, which is courts, prosecutors, politicians, influential business people not, being potential collateral damage of a case, therefore it doesn't proceed. None of that's off the table in Canada at this point. None of it. This is just real talk.
Well, I mean, look, you can go to Vancouver. I saw a listing not too long ago for a house on Main Street, which for people watching who aren't familiar, Main Street is a neighborhood in East Vancouver that when I was growing up was a fucking dump. And it's going for $11 million.
Yeah.
Right. You can walk around Richmond specifically, but anywhere in Vancouver and just see lines of Ferraris and Lamborghinis and Maseratis. You can go into businesses that aren't businesses. You can't buy anything there. There's storefronts, but there's nothing for sale. Just put two and two together, man. And this stuff doesn't happen without like the cooperation of people who should be regulating this stuff. It just doesn't. It can't happen without collusion on the law enforcement and government level. It just can't.
Speaking of cars, I'm just gonna and corruption. I'll just add to something. That I'm not. I won't name a name. People would recognize it, but British Columbia has a provincial auto insurer, and when cars can get written off, and then they can be really damaged, or they can not be damaged, and people will make a claim on them, and they can go into a dealership and be shipped to China and sold. So British Columbia is the type of province where the provincial insurer, people would not understand the level of organized crime involved in auto crashes, fake crashes and claims. and they wouldn't understand the level of corruption going up to the top of the government, I believe, in terms of the people taking advantage of that system. That's the type of province it is, 100%.
It's a narco criminal province. I
Yeah,
mean,
it is.
ICBC is the company, is the insurer that you are referring to. I
Yeah.
was a customer of ICBC for many years, and I just for people, I owned a Toyota Camry, a 2015 Toyota Camry. It was the only car I owned in Vancouver. Now that I live in Alberta, I own multiple because I actually have a little bit of money in my pocket. But while I was in Vancouver, it was the only car I could afford. And my car insurance was $486 per month. I have never been in a car accident in my life. Neither have my wife. And what they're doing is they're leveraging the insurance of people like me against the criminal activity that people like that Sam is alluding to.
Yeah,
And
the people in the e-pirate investigation, I could find all their names in multiple car crashes. So the reason you good tax-paying BC citizens have high insurance rates is because Chinese, Iranian, foreign organized crime is just gutting that insurance system. Yeah.
and look, because BC is a socialist wasteland, the insurer is the ICBC is the only insurer in British Columbia. So you have one option if you want to insure your vehicle. There are no private insurers. So, anyways, let's move into the next part of this, because so in your story, I can't remember if she owned or she worked for a cannabis processing corporation. Did she own one?
She's at a high level in a number of cannabis processing, and this will probably tie in nicely to what you're talking to Steve Robinson about, and what I've talked about, how Chinese organized crime has taken over licensed for a good couple decades now, licensed, quote, medical marijuana production, especially, in British Columbia, Ontario. But yeah, it just shows how, well, to answer your question, this female scientist with deep familial connections to the Chinese state and CCP and United Front in Vancouver, has been at the head of a number of these Vancouver corporations that get involved in supposedly Health Canada licensed marijuana, under Justin Trudeau's regime, or beforehand in BC. It was already known for years kind of that the direction was going there, that this would be legalized in Canada. And so she's involved in patents for, industrial scale processing of hemp to extract, CBD or THC, and, technology to throw that into everything from pills to edibles to suppositories to vape pens. and so I can go through various company filings that she's involved in as a science tech advisor, and find that their business plans were producing or extracting industrial scale of the narcotic properties from hemp and shipping it around the world in products. And this involved bringing in technology from Chinese-based pharmaceutical and factory companies, bringing machinery into Vancouver to be used by at least one scientist that works at the University of British Columbia. She's involved similarly in a similar sort of operation in Oregon, right? So talk about cross-border and a person allegedly involved in precursors for serious narcotics from China having access to the United States. Here's a case. And, it points to me to what I now know after years of looking at it, starting with the Hells Angels, who used to be the high-level organized crime in Canada, especially on the West Coast, being involved deeply in any number of sham corporations that are involved in biopharma, medical marijuana. There's just a huge network in Vancouver, again, talking about the illegal wealth of organized crime involved in stock investing frauds, marijuana companies, getting supplies from China, involved in criminality across Canada. And this case, this woman is in the dead center of that, and specifically on the Chinese state scientific and chemicals that only very well connected people in China can be involved in shipping to Canada and receiving in Canada. Right dead center of that. And again, from benign marijuana to ecstasy to who the hell knows what else. It's just part of a Chinese state, I'm saying, infiltration and operation that works with what used to be the ruling organized crime in Canada, but isn't anymore.
And, you know, look, we're talking about this, and this is so vast and so big. And you gotta, for people listening, you gotta wrap your mind around the billions of dollars generated by this. We're talking billions with a B, billions of dollars generated by all of this activity. And I find it hard to believe that some of those billions of dollars don't end up back in the pockets of our federal, provincial, and municipal politicians.
Let me tell you, I was at a conference recently with some high level police and criminal intelligence people. I was asked to present, and what I heard on the record from a very, very senior Canadian criminal intelligence official was that Canadians have no idea how embedded the Mexican cartels are in Canada. And again, as we've discussed, the cartels, billion-dollar brutal terrorist organizations that work hand in glove with the CCP, who supply them precursors and launder their money around the world. That's the deal. And it's not that Chinese crime just leaves the lab production and the gangsterism to the cartels. They've got their teams on shoulder to shoulder with the cartels as well. But the CCP is at the top of the show. But my point here is this very senior Canadian official told the crowd that I later addressed in a panel of law enforcement professionals, cartels are $1 billion a day operation. They are extremely embedded worldwide, extremely embedded in Canada, and they thrive through corruption. So are the cartels, directly corrupting Canadian officials? I'm sure they are. There's no question. Depends how high they go. But as someone else astutely said, on a podcast, someone that's doing a similar type of work, they actually told Sean Ryan this. I think they've been following my work. They said, yeah, the cartels are working with the CCP, and the CCP is in charge of corruption of politicians in Canada. So the Mexican cartels would not necessarily have to be the ones doing the payoffs. China's doing that for them. But yeah, to your point, people do not have to speculate or take it from me, a mere journalist. I'm reporting what criminal intelligence senior official in Canada says. This crime in Canada is thriving on corruption.
Yes. And one example of such, if you want to go back through my conversations with Sam Cooper, there was a moment where $1 million+ was donated to the Trudeau Foundation by a questionable figure.
Questionable, yeah.
United Front Work Department agent in 2015, slightly just before Justin Trudeau began his campaign on legal marijuana. And this is coming from me. I'm a cannabis user. I'm like, you know what I mean? I was behind that. I was like, yes, let's do it. But now that I see where we are, I'm like, that was a terrible idea. And, I'm from BC. I know how to get really good, high quality, non-pesticide marijuana. But it seems like now the entire market is just flooded with this dirty Chinese weed covered in pesticides that Steve Robinson told me they couldn't even identify in the United States. They had to bring in the weapons of mass destruction squad from the National Guard to identify the chemicals that were being used on these plants.
Yeah, everything from PCP, I've been told fentanyl waste, and whatever dirty chemical from China, just to, who knows why it's put in there, from increasing the volume to whatever. Yeah. And so, I mean, the larger point here is the theory of having the government run this program, especially if organic, real, grown from the ground stuff is helpful to some people medically, as we know by now,
Yeah.
yeah, fair game. But you have to have the government structures in place to regulate that. And Canada doesn't. So doing that, it's like, I mean, anyone that really knew how policing and courts work in Canada could have told you it was a bad decision, because Canada could not police that, even if it wasn't a corrupt decision, designed to go sideways for China from the start. Even if it was with good intentions, Canada doesn't have the capacity to police that, right? And so, yeah. I mean, fix your ability to actually run criminals through the court before you take on something like that, legalization.
Well, our mutual friend Mark Cahotis has popularized the term Arctic Mexico in reference to Canada. I've begun calling it Toontown, because I'm more and more convinced that this is just a cartoon country. Like, we're not a serious country in any way. And like what you said, like, we don't have law enforcement interested in policing this at all. We don't have politicians who are interested in even addressing it. We don't have a media that, other than Sam Cooper, that's interested in pursuing this story, which is the story. It's the biggest story. And so what are we doing? I mean, we're literally living in Sam's book, Willful Blindness. Like, that's where we are. And we're just in Toontown. We're in a cartoon country that doesn't really exist.
And it's getting worse because, back when I wrote the book in 2021, I still thought that David Eby had a chance of being a good politician. And now, years later, once that guy gets control of the province, I've been very clear that there's no question that he's surrounded by CCP agents. I don't doubt that the US government has deep concerns about their influence on him. And how does that look when David Eby and BC Ferries give away $1 billion contract to a Chinese military dual use connected producer, right? That very easily, if China goes ahead and attacks Taiwan, Canada and David Eby will have a hand in helping China do that. That's not to mention, the Canadian national security problems of allowing China to implant their technology into our systems. Right. So decision after decision from someone like a David Eby. Doug Ford is starting to look very wonky himself. You got to be, I've got to put my thinking hat on to point to Canadian politicians that are doing the right thing to take our country forward in a good direction. Right. And again, this isn't just my thinking. As I've said, I've now reached a certain level of expertise where I'm asked to address senior law enforcement or intelligence type people on panels. And in those type of situations, whether on the sidelines or presentations like I just told you about, hearing a senior Canadian official say cartels are $1 billion a day business and they're deeply embedded in Canada, you wouldn't hear that, but you don't hear that from Ottawa, right? So I need to pick and choose between what police officials are to be believed and are honorable, what politicians are to believe and be honorable, and it's getting harder and harder.
Yeah, and that Doug Ford that Sam Cooper just referenced is the same Doug Ford who just a few days ago boasted about cozying up in front of the fireplace with our central banker prime minister, a man that I lovingly referred to as a very well written punchline from God. So, anyways, Sam, on to other things. While we're talking about international drug shipments, you ran another story about a DEA bust in Arizona regarding more precursor, but this time fentanyl precursor. Can you fill us in on that? What happened there? And just break it down for us, man, because this one is nuts.
That's a huge one. And again, it's consistent with stories I've done over the past year. I have to search my mind. I did nut stories. Before I get into that one, which is huge, I'll make two thematic connections. But I did a story about Ryan Wedding, the former Canadian Olympic snowboarder, who's a most wanted for the FBI, is a Sinaloa cartel, big guy. But I wrote that my information and documents point to even potentially as strong connections between Ryan Wedding and a woman from the Iranian community very close to him in Vancouver, being very influential in his crime networks, and how Ryan Wedding, as a Sinaloa cartel guy, was very involved in sort of an Iranian Hezbollah type interwoven drug trafficking case that brought in Venezuela, Halifax, Mexico, BC, just again showing how crazy these stories are. But this one in British Columbia with a senior gangster from the Brothers Keepers, this Indo-Canadian gang that rises to the top of up there near the Hells Angels in kind of the brutality and the level of distribution of drugs in British Columbia. They get up there, as I've written in other stories in recent years, because the Sinaloa cartel has basically taken over and asserted their control in BC and used the Brothers Keepers as a proxy. And so this guy, Singh Sian, his last name is a little tricky, but we'll just call him Singh. He's taken down in the United States a year ago, and a document comes out very recently that explains how he's part of a major DEA operation that starts in Turkey, where they insert, another senior Latin American narco who's a DEA source. And she's called the Queen. That's her code name. She's able to sort of get into this BC Brothers Keepers gangsters systems, and they get him involved in all kinds of British Columbia methamphetamine deals going through the Los Angeles port, sort of showing how Canada is, again, this precursor and drug production hub from China. And it is, of course, running its drugs into the United States, just as Kash Patel says, and then bouncing them off to Australia. So there's a 2-for-1 there of how Canada, as a proxy for China, with an Indo-Canadian gangster, is hurting the rest of the world, including, in this case, America, Australia. But for me, the real finding in that case is the DEA get the Queen, their senior narco confidential source. These people are able to survive in the drug world because they are used as agents. So the DEA picks its poison sometimes, and they get her to ask this Vancouver-based gangster, can he procure precursors for fentanyl? And he says yes. So they get those deals going. They prove that he can send it to LA, Los Angeles, directly from China. They have him on wiretaps saying he can do it. They get him doing it. And so they put the cherry on the top of this operation. They send the Queen up to Vancouver. This is in a DEA affidavit from the agent in charge. And she sits down with this Indo-Canadian gangster with his daughter and wife at a restaurant in downtown Vancouver. They then proceed to go to a coffee shop and sit down with a guy named Peter Payne, P-E-N-G, who tells them in very broken English that he can provide 100 kilograms of fentanyl precursors per month, ship them to Los Angeles from Vancouver, directly from China, using his Indo-Canadian gangster truck company as a front. So on the surface, this looks like an Indo-Canadian drug operation, but at the top, you have the CCP providing the precursors through a Chinese gangster, and they are working with the Sinaloa cartel. Again, so this is another case showing that triangle of these high-level themes that, we've been talking about, and Kash Patel recently talked about. And I mean, let me just underline that 100 kilograms of fentanyl precursors. So how much fentanyl with the other additives, food dyes, how many fake oxycodone pills can 100 kilograms of fentanyl precursors per month shipped from Vancouver into America produce? Distributed probably by the Sinaloa cartel, that terrorist organization. So it's just, that's a lot. That's enough to kill On a monthly level, that's enough to kill. I won't even say the number. A lot of Americans, right?
Yeah.
Again, we're pointing to Vancouver, a Chinese gangster using these very powerful street gangs in Vancouver, and it's all originating from China.
And I think like the key part of this that everybody needs to pay attention to is the convergence of these organized crime gangs. I mean, we're talking like this is like the Justice League of bad guys, you know, all
In
coming
Vancouver,
together,
yeah.
all
This is
coming
their
together.
clubhouse. This is their clubhouse, Vancouver.
Right.
David
And it's
Eby's Vancouver.
I love that. I love that you threw that in there because this is let's talk about David Eby for a second. Sam, I know we're running out of time here, but what is going on there? Because look, I'm from the Christy Clark, Vancouver, which is, you know, you and I have talked about her before, and she definitely has some questionable connections in her post-political career that kind of leads us to perhaps speculate on her involvement in what happened in Vancouver in years prior, right?
Yep.
But David Eby seems to be a different animal. Is he like, okay, just to put it in plain English here, is he just a hapless idiot, or is he a willing participant, or is he well, I think those are the only two options. Is he stupid or is he involved in your view? Speculation, by the way,
It's
speculation.
not speculation, because this is where the controversial and extremely intelligent and accomplished Mark Cohodes, the guy that made his money, and I'm not saying he's always right, but he's made money by being right enough times. By right, I say, you know, picking when a company is fraudulent and it collapses, and so people in Mark's line of investment work get rich that way by knowing when something's criminal. So David Eby, when he was an opposition politician attacking the corruption in Christy Clark's government, he looked like a very strong candidate to be one of these, what I'm saying are few and far between politicians of honor, integrity, and intelligence in Canada that could turn the good ship Canada around before it goes under. And then he had me convinced for a while that he was a good politician. And then I noticed something very strange. During the anti-money laundering provincial inquiry that stemmed from my work, and that David Eby had seemed to be, you know, a big fan of going against that money laundering corruption, out of the blue, it comes out that David Eby had engineered a public apology to a Chinese community leader for David Eby's role in a study that looked into how China, or investment from China that had to be corrupt, was flooding into Vancouver real estate and taking over whole neighborhoods. Eby was part of that study, and then when it became politically uncomfortable for him, I guess he realized my speculation. He realized that Chinese community voters were not only, you know, numerically important, but important in other ways to be a leader in British Columbia. He goes and he apologizes to a broadcaster in British Columbia who I asserted in my book very clearly, you know, before I knew that this guy was a listed United Front, kind of credited for election interference. Very clearly an asset for China in many ways, and overtly in his actions. Guy's name is David Ding. I named him in a news conference in Ottawa, Ding Guo. And this guy is an advisor, a community advisor for David Eby. David Eby won't cut that tie. And so he apologizes to this guy. And then this guy and his sham media entities that are, I'm going to assert, are part of, you know, China's disinformation and intelligence system. They're part of the election interference system. After David Eby prostrates himself and apologizes for his role in an anti-money laundering study, to this guy, this Chinese media asset. Chinese media asset writes, people vote for David Eby. He's a good guy. He's my friend. Okay, so that was my first indication. That was my, and I'll say it. I'll say it at any level. If I'm asked to go testify before the U.S. Congress, which apparently some people, are rumbling, maybe I'll get invited to go, share what I know in Washington. I'll point to David Eby and David Dingwo and say, this is an example of a Canadian politician being captured. Now look at what happens in his province. $1 billion deal goes to a Chinese civil military fusion, ship producer. BC is being used and used egregiously by China for their fentanyl and money laundering. It gets worse, but I think that's enough to answer your question of what I think happened to David Eby. And Mark Cahotis now says that, he was very close to David Eby. He also, to answer your question, will say David Eby is an extremely intelligent lawyer. David Eby has been briefed by people that helped me learn about the Vancouver model of money laundering. And David Eby understood it deeply before David Eby got power. So that tells you that if I now go from the facts that I told you or what I'm saying, that I'll assert with the highest confidence that David Eby is captured, it could be that British Columbia as an economy and a political system institutionally, after 40 to 50 years of Canada choosing Asia Pacific trade from China as a high level trade strategy, British Columbia has been captured. That's why Christy Clark could have been your villain. Rich Coleman, was he in charge of ICBC? I think he was. Was he in charge of BC casinos? Famous BC Liberal politician. Pick your politician in British Columbia, and you could say, they've been influenced by China at some level. And so David Eby, who comes in looking like the white knight that's going to turn the ship around, maybe that province is just so deeply captured that you would have to be the person of utmost integrity to not be sucked into that quagmire, as David Eby has been. I think Brad West, as the provincial leader, I don't bet, but I'd bet some money that Brad West is at this point one of the few that can turn that province around. And I've said Brad West should be Canada's fentanyl czar, one of the few with the integrity, again, as I've said, trusted by Secretary of State Antony Blinken with some very sensitive information. So that was a rather broad way to answer what I think happened to David Eby and the structure of the province that made what happened to David Eby surface.
To me, there's a strange connection between, say, for example, David Eby and what's currently happening now with Donald Trump and this Epstein thing. But I think it's a similar circumstance where you're a smart guy, you want to bring change, you get into office and somebody comes to you and says, hey, look, this is the way things work. We're going to let you have some things, but the big stuff, in Trump's case, Epstein, in Eby's case, China, the big stuff, if you touch it, you die. It's just the way it goes. I just feel like it has to be like that because it doesn't make sense. Like I've talked to Mark off the record about David Eby, talked to you at periods about him. He seems like he was a guy with dignity and integrity who, wanted to actually steer that ship and right the wrongs. And then I don't know what happens. It's like he makes it worse, and he's clearly captured and he's clearly involved in this. And look, and for people listening, why is this BC Ferries issue such a big deal? And for our American listeners, BC Ferries is the company that services the ferries to take people between the mainland of British Columbia and Vancouver Island. Well, we're talking $1 billion+ in a circumstance where Canada is currently in a trade war with the United States, and we have shipbuilders and materials producers who could have very much used that $1 billion+. But instead, we have now contracted a CCP company, a CCP military company to build those ships for us. through David Eby.
Yeah, it makes no sense in any world. It has to be a corruption of some form. It's interesting that Gregor Robertson, the former Vancouver mayor, purportedly now is the one in charge of this Ottawa Development Bank that under the table. So
Amazing how that works, isn't it?
amazing how it works that Gregor Robertson apparently had his hands on this $1 billion low interest loan that facilitates the BC Ferries deal. And there are literally, I mean, it's not just a matter of national security concerns that allowing Chinese tech in your systems. Anyone with any knowledge on the subject knows that that's a way for them to spy on you or like get leverage over you. But beyond that, there are literally, I believe, U.S. government reports that say that funding companies that build ferry technology for China is directly contributing to their capacity to build their most important asset for landing on Taiwan, which they overtly now say that this is kind of the big concern of our world, of the US government, that they're preparing for war with China over that issue. And so David Eby and his friends, including Gregor Robertson, apparently, we can say, are helping China build the technology. It's not an exaggeration. They're adding to the capacity of China for their war capacity, not to mention our own national security risks.
Totally. And as we wrap up here, for people listening who are unfamiliar with who Gregor Robertson is, he was the mayor of Vancouver during the time when Chinese organized crime, CCP connected Chinese organized crime, and the United Front Work Department and fentanyl and everything exploded all at the same time under his watch as mayor of Vancouver, right?
Yeah. And I know we both got to run now, but when you mentioned Gregor Robertson, so much went on. He, along with people like the local condo kings, I won't bother saying their names, called that study that David Eby was involved in by a great academic named Andy Yan that looked at how Chinese mortgages were taking over Vancouver. Gregor Robertson, his words were the tone had racial overtone. The study had racial overtones, so obviously calling it racist. And it just shows how that explains why when David Eby gets in power, he flips over to the Gregor Robertson point of view, right? Which shows how leaders are captured. And Gregor in Vancouver by China, and Gregor Robertson memorably had his marriage broken up when he got into a relationship with a young female Chinese pop star whose mother was involved in a major corruption case in China, and everything circling around that case had the elements of what's called a honey trap or leverage on Gregor Robertson. And I'm not just I've heard that from a former CSIS officer. So that you cannot make this up in Hollywood. This is all real Vancouver politics.
It's just wild, man. It's wild that this is where we are, that this is our country. This is what we've become. We're just here now, Toontown, and Sam, so for everybody that can hear the pounding in the back, there's construction going on outside of my house. Sorry, guys. Sam Cooper, I'm just so happy you're on this beat. I'm so glad you're home. Dude, I was staring, like I said, staring through rainy window panes, imagining Sam Cooper on a wave runner somewhere in the Adriatic going, Sam, just come home, talk to me. Dude, yeah, I'm so glad you're back. I just, as you and I both are shifting our focus away from the micro and looking toward the macro, as I said in the beginning in this episode, it just becomes more apparent how important the micro is. And, you just gave another example. By handing this BC Ferries contract over to China, we are increasing their capacity to land on Taiwan. And for people who are watching this, look, Israel, Iran, Ukraine, Russia are in the news. They eat up most of the news cycle whenever something happens. But China, Taiwan is going to be the one that sets off a third world war. That's the one that's going to cause us to fall into large scale global war. And that's the one that is going to happen. It's inevitable sooner or later. And all David Eby and friends in the British Columbia government are doing is they are increasing China's ability to start that war.
Yeah, that war is bubbling. I mean, a coup against President Xi, maybe that averts it. But right now, this is what keeps people at Washington up at night. Absolutely.
Totally. So, Sam Cooper, my brother, I'm going to let you off the hook. I'm going to let you get back to doing your reporting and taking it nice and slow and smooth for the summer. Before we go, bro, can you tell everybody where they can find you?
Yeah, look at the brand on your hat there. You're wearing it well today, The Bureau, and you go thebureau.news and become one of the over 30,000 subscribers and hopefully a paying subscriber too. And you can also find me on Twitter at Scooper Cooper.
Guys, I say this every episode, sign up at the Bureau, but sign up as a paid subscriber. Sam is only able to do the work that he does with your support. And I mean that. Sam is completely independent and he answers to nobody but Sam Cooper. And so if you want to keep that going, please sign up as a paid subscriber. It is so important that guys like Sam are independent and beholden to nobody. Because as soon as outside investors and advertisers get involved, you do run into circumstances and situations where things that you may want to report on, you might have to tread lightly around. Sam has none of those restrictions. That's why he is who he is. That's why he's balls to the wall, burn it all down, Sam. Right? So if that's what you want and you appreciate Sam's reporting, please sign up as a paid subscriber at thebureau.news. Follow him on X at Scooper Cooper. I am a habitual refresher of his feed. And if you follow Sam, you will be too. My brother, I know you got a lot more in the chamber. So should we come back in a few weeks?
Yep. Let's summer schedule. Keep it going smooth and enjoy your summer too.
Thanks, brother. I'll talk to you soon.